Hey there. Tonight, we are following a stone face into the dark. Recently, researchers aimed high-resolution scanners and advanced AI models at the oldest Olmec heads in Mexico. And the strange thing was not that the software found weathering, or cracks, or ordinary damage. It found hidden patterns tucked inside the stone itself, lines too precise to be noticed by the eye, density changes that did not behave like simple basalt, and buried features suggesting these monuments may have been built for more than being looked at. So if you enjoy these slow walks into the oldest corners of history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you would like to return for more nights like this one. Now let the room grow a little dimmer. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your jaw unclench. Feel the weight of the day drift down through the bed, or the chair, or wherever you happen to be listening. Tonight there is no rush at all. We are only going to sit beside the fire together and listen to stone. If you were standing here with me, the first thing you would notice is the silence. Not ordinary silence, not the polite kind that fills a museum room, but an older kind, a silence that seems to wait. The Olmec heads have that quality. They do not merely sit, they endure. Great dark faces cut from volcanic rock, with heavy lids and wide noses, and mouths held in a calm that can almost feel deliberate. Their features are human, very human, and yet the stillness around them makes them seem to belong to something larger than one person, larger than one lifetime, larger perhaps than memory itself. The Olmec lived in what is now southern Mexico, mainly along the Gulf Coast, in the humid lowlands of Veracruz and Tabasco. Their story begins more than 3,000 years ago, around 1,500 years before the Common Era. That date alone is enough to slow the mind. While later peoples like the Maya and the Aztec are better known, the Olmec stand farther back in the dimness, earlier, quieter, and somehow more unsettling because so much about them comes in fragments. A mound here, a figurine there, a carved altar, a pattern scratched into jade. Then these colossal heads, as if the earth itself had chosen to keep a face or two and let the rest of the world fade. There are 17 known colossal heads so far. 17. Not hundreds. Not a vast field of them. Just enough to form a pattern, and not enough to make that pattern comfortable. Each one was carved from a single boulder of basalt, a hard volcanic stone, dark and dense and brutally heavy. The tallest rises more than 3 meters high. The heaviest weighs over 50 tons. When you sit with those numbers for a moment, they start to lose their neatness and become physical. 50 tons is not just a measurement. It is pressure. It is mass. It is the slow groan of earth under something that should not be easy to move, and certainly not easy to shape. And yet shape them the Olmec did. Each face appears distinct. This matters. These are not generic stone masks stamped out to fill a ceremonial plaza. The mouths differ. The eyes differ. The cheeks, the ears, the fullness of the lips, the proportions from brow to chin, they all shift from head to head. Many researchers have long believed these are portraits of rulers, or at least of elite men whose identities mattered deeply enough to be cast into stone on a scale that would make ordinary life look very small. Most of them wear what seem to be helmets, or ceremonial headgear, with bands and flaps and details that have invited endless debate. Warriors, ball players, rulers, ancestors, guardians. The suggestions come and go. The faces remain. Honestly, I have always found it strange that these heads can look so calm while causing so much trouble for the imagination. Because the trouble begins the moment you stop admiring them and start asking practical questions. The sort of questions that make archaeology both thrilling and slightly annoying. In a healthy way. Where did the stone come from? How was it moved? Who organized the labor? How many hands touched each surface? What did the sculptors see in the rock before the face emerged? And perhaps most disquieting of all, why do these monuments feel less like decoration and more like components of something we have not fully named? The basalt used for most of the heads came from the Sierra de los Tuxtlas, a volcanic mountain region more than 90 kilometers away from the main ceremonial centers where the heads were found. 90 kilometers may not sound impossible to a modern ear, trained by roads and engines and freight systems. But set those comforts aside for a moment. The Olmec had no wheeled transport in use for monument hauling. They had no draft animals to pull weight for them, no oxen, no horses, no metal tools, no iron edges to bite rock, no steel to reinforce sledges. Just people, wood, fiber, stone, water, knowledge, coordination, and time. This is where the old mystery begins, even before AI enters the room. To quarry a boulder is one thing. To move it through humid terrain, through river systems, over mud and brush and lowland ground, is another. To do it again and again, and then to turn that raw block into a face of such controlled volume and expression, that is something else entirely. Archaeologists have offered several theories. Perhaps the boulders were rolled on logs. Perhaps they were dragged over prepared tracks with ropes made from plant fibers. Perhaps they were loaded onto rafts and floated along river routes for long stretches before the final overland haul. Each idea makes a certain amount of sense. Each one also leaves gaps. That does not mean the Olmec could not have done it. It only means that certainty slips away when we reach for it. There is very little direct physical evidence of the transport systems themselves. No preserved dragging lanes. No massive rope caches lying obligingly in the soil. No diagram scratched onto a wall with a cheerful note explaining the whole process for future researchers. Ancient people are rarely so considerate. They leave results, and we stand there centuries later trying to reverse engineer the thought, the labor, the ritual, and the weather. Then comes the carving problem. Basalt is not gentle. It does not welcome the hand the way limestone can. It is a stubborn stone, hard enough to resist, coarse enough to punish impatience. Shaping it with stone tools would have taken an immense amount of labor. Pecking, grinding, smoothing, reworking, more grinding, dust settling into skin, dust gathering in the lines of a wrist, dust carried away by damp wind. To bring out a lip line with grace, to balance the width of the nose, to hold the eyes in proper relation to the mouth across such a scale, all without metal, That requires discipline so patient it begins to sound like prayer. And still, the heads are not rough. That is one of the details I keep circling back to. Their features are broad, yes, but not careless. The mouths have presence. The eyes are controlled. The contours across cheek and jaw are confident. In some examples, the symmetry is strong enough that even casual viewers sense the planning behind it. Later on, AI would measure that planning in ways no one expected. But even before the scanners arrived, the heads already carried the quiet evidence of decisions made with precision. The Olmec were not defined only by these heads. Of course, they also built massive earthen platforms and ceremonial centers. They shaped altars and thrones from stone. They carved scenes of human figures and mythic beings into monuments that still seem to lean halfway between politics and cosmology. They worked jade with astonishing refinement. They used symbols that may represent an early writing system, or at least a meaningful visual language. They transformed the landscape with plazas, mounds, and controlled spaces. The heads sit inside that wider world, which matters because it reminds us that they were not random acts of artistic obsession. They belonged to a civilization that understood labor, ceremony, symbolism, and scale. And yet the Olmec are shadowed by disappearance. By around 400 years before the Common Era, their major centers had declined. Other Mesoamerican cultures would inherit and transform many ideas that seem to have older Olmec roots. Certain religious motifs, artistic conventions, ceremonial planning principles, perhaps even ways of imagining rulership and the sacred landscape. All of this seems to ripple forward. But the Olmec themselves do not stand before us as a continuous people speaking in their own voice. Much of their language is gone. Much of their record is buried or lost. Their daily life survives only in traces. Their monuments remain, and sometimes that feels like a cruel little joke from history. The faces are still here. The explanations are not. There is one more thing that deepens the unease. Some of the heads appear to have been altered, reused, or reshaped from earlier monuments. This means the stone may already have had one life before receiving a face. The throne might become a head. A monument might be revised after a political change. An earlier sacred object might be transformed into another form without losing all memory of the first. You know that feeling when an object seems to contain its past uses, even after being remade. An old house with walls that do not quite agree with the newer floor plan. A book whose margins remember more than the printed text. The Olmec heads can feel like that. They are not always singular gestures. Sometimes they seem layered. One head from a site called La Cobata appears unfinished. I find that one especially haunting. The roughness remains. The form has not fully settled into the face it was meant to become. There is something intimate about unfinished work, because it reminds you that every mystery began in ordinary time. Someone had a plan. Someone raised tools. Someone measured a line with the eye and the hand. Then something happened. Perhaps a ruler died. Perhaps labor was redirected. Perhaps the stone itself disappointed its makers. Perhaps the site changed. Whatever the reason, the work stopped. And thousands of years later, the interruption is still there. I like to imagine the workshop, though carefully, because imagination can run ahead of evidence if you let it. Still, some details are safe to picture. Morning dampness lingering on packed earth. The mineral smell of fresh broken rock. Men resting their palms on a boulder that still has no face. Only potential. The soft scrape of abrasive stone against basalt. A foreman, or maybe a ritual specialist, stepping back to judge the curve of a cheek. Someone wiping grit from the eyes. Someone else carrying water. The patient repetition of labor before symbolism fully appears. Ancient monuments can seem effortless because the finished thing has forgotten the exhaustion that made it. The unfinished head remembers. So that was the state of the mystery for a long time. Great stone heads. Enormous logistical questions. Limited direct evidence for transport. Hard stone, shaped with no metal. Distinct faces. Possible rulers. Signs of reuse. Signs of ceremony. Signs of a civilization both sophisticated and elusive. Archaeologists could excavate, compare, photograph, measure by hand, sketch, cast, and describe. All of that mattered. All of it still matters. But there are limits to what the naked eye can do, especially when the object in front of you weighs more than a house full of people and has spent centuries enduring rain, roots, burial, damage, and time. That is where the modern part of our story begins. Not with a dramatic explosion of certainty. Not with someone in a lab coat shouting that history must be rewritten by sunrise. Real research is rarely so theatrical. It begins, more often, with a practical desire to preserve what is already there. The heads are vulnerable to weathering, vandalism, gradual erosion, and the slow abrasion of climate. Surfaces soften. Microfractures spread. Details vanish grain by grain. And so researchers did what modern researchers do when an ancient thing refuses to explain itself. They looked closer. Portable structured light scanners were brought in. Laser surface mapping. Photogrammetry. Then advanced AI models trained to compare different kinds of marks and textures. The intention at first was conservative, almost modest. Create accurate digital records. Preserve geometry. Track surface condition. Plan conservation. Maybe identify known tool marks more clearly. Maybe distinguish human carving from later damage a little better. A reasonable plan. A calm plan. The sort of plan that sounds almost sleepy until the first anomaly appears and the machine starts pointing where the human eye had never lingered. Picture it for a moment. A field tent or temporary lab near the site. The air thick, warm, and carrying that faint green scent of wet vegetation outside. A scanner casting patterned light across a face that has stared through centuries of rain. Laptop screens glowing cool blue against the dark. Data points accumulating by the millions. Not romance. Exactly. But its modern cousin. Patience. Precision. The very old and the very new, facing one another in silence. On one side, basalt. Mountain-born and laboriously transformed. On the other side, code. Mathematics. And trained models built to separate the expected from the statistically strange. The AI was not there to invent mysteries. That matters. The software was trained on known carving marks, erosion patterns, weather damage, natural surface changes, and ordinary irregularities in stone. Its job was basically humble. Notice the surface. Notice what belongs. Notice what does not. For a while, the result seemed ordinary enough. Edges, chips, tool scars, already suspected. Then, small alerts began to appear. Fine repeated lines in places no one had paid much attention to. Slight recesses near buried portions. Density irregularities that did not sit neatly inside the expected behavior of basalt. Little things. At first, archaeology often changes by little things. I have always loved that about it. Not the drama of treasure, but the quiet scandal of pattern. A half-millimeter groove in the wrong place. A polished strip where weather should have roughened the surface. A hollow where solid mass was expected. These things do not shout. They murmur. They ask for another scan, and then another. They ask researchers to repeat the process using different software, different light, different modeling assumptions. They ask the control object to step forward. So the unfinished head was scanned as well. That was clever. A control is a kind of honesty ritual in science. You ask the system to read something expected. If the model starts finding hidden wonders everywhere, then perhaps it is only dreaming in public. But the unfinished head behaved itself. It showed rough tool work, expected irregularities, no extraordinary hidden patterning. That helped settle the nerves a little. The software was not merely hallucinating beauty in stone. It was detecting a difference. And that is where we will go next. Into the blue glow of software and measured light. Into the strange moment when a monument that had already survived 3,000 years began to disclose another layer of itself. Not by changing, but by finally being seen in a different way. The heads had not become stranger. We had simply reached the edge of our older seeing, and the machine, calm and tireless, was beginning to point beyond it. The first truly unsettling detail was not dramatic to look at. That is usually how these things work. If history ever hands you a perfect revelation, bright and theatrical and impossible to misread, you should become suspicious at once. Real discoveries tend to arrive smaller than expected. A line too regular, a surface too smooth, a void where there should be none. The first AI alerts on the Olmec heads had that quality. They seemed modest until they began repeating. Researchers had collected dense digital models using structured light scanning, laser surface mapping, and photogrammetry. Then they passed those models through an AI pipeline trained to separate known categories of surface behavior. Human carving marks, natural weathering, root disturbance, microfractures, erosion patterns, recent damage. The system was not asked to prove anything extraordinary. It was asked to notice deviation. That is all. Yet the farther the modeling went, the less stable the old confidence became. One of the first anomalies appeared as a pattern of very fine parallel striations on the side of a head. The marks were sheltered beneath a decorative element near the jaw, a place where casual viewing would never linger long. In ordinary light, they were almost nothing, but in the three-dimensional mesh, with lighting angles adjusted and the software allowed to exaggerate micro-relief. The lines emerged with unsettling clarity. They were shallow, consistent, repeated, too regular to dismiss at once, and too small to have mattered to the monument as public display. That last part is important. If a detail is invisible to the audience, why put it there at all? Researchers compared the striations against known patterns from Mesoamerican stoneworking: pecking marks, battering, smoothing, abrasive finishing, later weather streaking. The lines did not fit cleanly with any one category. Some thought they resembled abrasion scoring, the kind of controlled, repeated contact one might associate with later machining or highly disciplined grinding. That comparison remains cautious, and it should remain cautious. No serious archaeologist wants a melodrama where there is only texture. Still, the marks stood apart enough that the software kept flagging them. Then there was the circular recess near the buried base of one sculpture, because part of the monument had remained beneath the ground. That section had not been studied in detail for decades. Once the full object was reconstructed digitally, the shape emerged more clearly. It was shallow, cleanly defined, almost socket-like, less than 5 centimeters deep. Not large enough to overturn history by itself, just large enough to be awkward. If natural, it was peculiarly neat. If intentional, its function was obscure. No one had an easy comparison from other large Mesoamerican sculptures. The recess simply sat there in the data, quiet and uncooperative. Another scan suggested an internal inconsistency in density near the crown of one head. Now we move from surface to interior, and that is where the atmosphere changes. A surface can mislead. Weather can play tricks. Light can flatter nonsense into pattern. But when modeling begins to imply something within the mass of the stone, something long sealed and hidden, the mind becomes alert in a different way. Basalt can contain natural voids. That is true. Gas bubbles, irregularities from volcanic cooling, stress flaws. No one working carefully denied that. But the flagged zone inside the head was not a neat, spherical bubble. It appeared more linear, more contained, more like a channel than a casual pocket. The team repeated the scans using different processing tools. Sensible again? If one model produces a mystery and another does not, then mystery may only be software vanity. But the same irregularities returned. The striations, the recess, the density shift. Little by little, a pattern formed. And pattern is what changes mood. One oddity can be shrugged away. Several oddities in several heads begin to feel like a conversation you are late to. At that stage, the work remained restrained. No lost machine civilization was announced. No impossible pronouncement was made. The language stayed careful. Anomalies, inconsistencies, hidden features not previously documented. I respect that restraint. Honestly, I trust a mystery more when the people nearest to it look slightly tired rather than euphoric. Tired means they have rechecked the numbers. Tired means they know how often certainty embarrasses itself. Then came some of the finer surface revelations. Photogrammetry, by comparing tiny changes in shadow and relief, suggested shallow carved lines behind the ears of one sculpture. Grid-like, very faint. The sort of thing a finger could pass over without much notice. The AI flagged them as statistically unlikely to be random. Elsewhere, symmetry analysis showed something almost rude in its precision. Most faces, even carefully carved ones, carry slight variation from side to side. Human hands wander. Vision adjusts. Stone resists. That is normal. But one Olmec head displayed near perfect bilateral alignment in key facial areas, especially around the mouth and eyes, at a level more typical of planned architectural measurement than of monumental freehand carving. This does not mean some lost machine hovered over the sculptor with mechanical mercy. It does mean planning may have been more systematic than many had assumed. Perhaps templates were used. Perhaps cord-based measurement systems guided the layout. Perhaps a standard of control existed in Olmec workshops that we have not appreciated fully because perishable measuring tools vanished long ago. That possibility alone is interesting enough. Ancient people are often underestimated until evidence gently humiliates the present. At San Lorenzo, one of the great Olmec centers, a deeper analysis produced one of the most unsettling sequences in the whole investigation. Along the inner curve of a head near the neck, the enhanced scans suggested a row of symmetrical indentations running vertically, evenly spaced, each with a similar arc. Not gouges from random damage. Not obvious fracture scars. Something more deliberate in appearance, though still hidden beneath the assumptions of ordinary viewing. The software could not match them confidently to any known sequence of natural decay. That left researchers with a difficult choice. Either the pattern was a strange but natural behavior of the stone, or it represented shaping activity not yet understood. Imagine the stone itself for a moment. Dense, volcanic, not eager to cooperate. Any attempt to produce interior or near-interior structuring without damaging the outer form would require a very sensitive grasp of force, grain, and stress. Basalt does not forgive clumsy ambition. You strike carelessly, and you do not merely mark the surface. You risk ugly fracture. Yet here were signs that the inner logic of the stone may have mattered to the makers more than anyone had realized. A separate line of analysis involved material composition. Portable X-ray fluorescence was used on one head, and the results showed irregular concentrations of hematite and magnetite in a narrow, polished band across the forehead. Those minerals are not inherently strange in the wider material world of Mesoamerica. Pigments can involve them. Geological variation can involve them. But the surprising part was their mode of appearance. This did not behave like paint laid onto a finished surface. The signature seemed embedded in the upper layer of the basalt itself, as if introduced or exposed during the working process rather than merely applied after carving. The band was slightly raised and did not follow any obvious decorative contour. It cut across the expected reading of the face. The AI flagged it because the section had fewer microfractures than neighboring zones and behaved as a distinct strip. Control samples from the likely quarry region did not show the same feature. That matters. If the source stone itself varied wildly, then the raised mineral band might be just one more geological quirk. But the comparison did not make that interpretation especially comfortable. We are left again with a feature that may be natural, yet does not behave like a simple geological shrug. Then there is the spiral. The spiral is the sort of detail that sounds invented when stated too quickly, which is why it helps to approach it slowly. On the back of one head, in a recessed area not meant for easy public viewing, a faint groove, less than half a millimeter deep, appeared to wind outward from a central point. 5 turns, almost a meter in total path length. Extremely subtle, nearly invisible, yet continuous enough to form a deliberate shape. Spirals do exist in broader Mesoamerican visual thought, often linked with water, wind, movement, or cycles of time. But on the hidden rear surface of a colossal head, and at such low visibility, the pattern resists neat placement. Decorative motifs are usually where people can see them. Hidden motifs belong to another category of intention. Some researchers began to lean more strongly toward the theory of monument recycling. Certain heads may have begun as thrones or large carved blocks, and only later been transformed into faces. That would explain crossing tool marks, unusual geometry, and overlapping zones of finish. It would explain why traces of earlier purposes survive in inconvenient places. One head may even preserve on its back the vestige of a seat-like contour, weathered almost into forgetfulness. The recycling model is sensible and grounded. It fits what we know of ancient societies reshaping existing sacred or political monuments. Stone was labor. Stone was prestige. Stone was memory. You did not waste it lightly. But even the recycling theory does not remove all unease. If the hidden spiral or internal indentations or socket-like recesses belonged to earlier stages, why were they preserved so carefully? Why do some features appear tucked away rather than aggressively erased? Reworking usually leaves scars of removal. In some cases, on the heads, what remains looks less like accidental survival and more like tolerated survival, or even quiet incorporation. There was also a geological wrinkle. One scanned head did not match the quarry signature as comfortably as expected. Its basalt showed a somewhat different grain structure, with more feldspar and slightly different magnetic properties. That does not mean the stone came from another continent or from some fairy tale source. It simply suggests either a different zone of the Tuxtlas Range or another source not previously mapped in relation to the heads. Even that smaller possibility has consequences. If the source zones varied more than assumed, then transport routes, quarry selection, and workshop planning may all have been more complicated than the standard story allows. What ties all of these anomalies together is not spectacle. It is invisibility. The eye alone was never likely to catch them. The heads were too large, too weathered, too burdened by expectation. Human beings are wonderful observers right up until we decide we already know what something is. Then we stop looking, which is one of the more charming flaws of our species. The AI did not possess mystical wisdom. It possessed ruthless patience. It reconstructed surfaces and volumes at sub-millimeter detail and compared them across categories without getting bored. That is sometimes enough to make an old assumption feel suddenly fragile. The larger implication began to form slowly. Either the Olmec had methods of planning and finishing more complex than the current model grants them, or the heads passed through multiple phases of use and modification more layered than previously recognized, or both. That last option is the one I keep coming back to. Both. Ancient craftsmanship and ancient monument life are often richer than the tidy categories built for textbooks. A head can be a portrait and a transformed monument. It can be a political image and a ceremonial device. It can be an object for public awe and a carrier of hidden design logic. At this point in the investigation, some of the most interesting ideas turned away from making and toward purpose, because once a monument begins to show hidden structure, one naturally wonders whether it was built for a hidden function as well. This is where the older interpretations of the heads as rulers, guardians, or memorials do not vanish, but start to feel thinner. The scans suggested depth in every sense. A face on the outside, planning underneath, maybe older forms inside newer ones, maybe alignments beyond the head itself. Maybe the monument belonged to a larger grammar of space. At La Venta, 4 heads were found buried within a ceremonial platform. Buried, not toppled casually, not left exposed as a ruined public display. Put away. That has always mattered, but it matters more now. If the heads were only public portraits, burial on that scale feels odd. If they were active ritual objects, or part of a cycle of installation and sealing, then burial begins to make another kind of sense. They were not discarded. They were closed. Some heads also show deliberate defacement, features chipped away, flattened zones, altered surfaces. Political damnation is one explanation, and a strong one. A fallen ruler can lose his face in stone before he loses it in memory. But ritual deactivation is another possibility. If a monument had a role within a ceremonial system, then damaging selected features might not be simple vandalism from within the culture. It might be part of how the object was retired, neutralized, or transitioned into another use. One of the more arresting details to emerge from later analysis involved orientation. Several heads face cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. That by itself is not enough to prove a cosmological function, because cardinal orientation is hardly rare in ancient planning. Still, within Mesoamerica, sacred architecture often aligns with celestial or calendrical logic. Temples, courts, platforms, and plazas can be tuned to light, horizon, or ritual movement. If the heads fit into that wider grammar, then they may have served not only as images of power, but as anchors in a spatial system connecting land, ceremony, and sky. There was also a tiny recessed sign on the back of one head at Tres Zapotes, a cross-like form within a circle. Small, easy to miss, not placed for casual admiration. Researchers have wondered whether it might have served as a directional or alignment marker, perhaps tied to positioning relative to other structures, or perhaps to a now vanished feature in the surrounding ceremonial landscape. Again, nothing impossible is required here. Only the recognition that hidden marks often belong to function rather than display. And that is the mood we are left with at the end of this stage of the story. Not certainty, not fantasy, a heavier, quieter thing. The realization that the Olmec heads may be more than portraits, more than monuments, more than solved examples of ingenuity in a pre-metal society. They may be layered objects, altered over time, placed with care, buried with intent, shaped according to systems of proportion and orientation that are only now beginning to show themselves under digital scrutiny. The strange comfort of archaeology is that every answer tends to reopen the room. AI was supposed to record these heads more perfectly. Instead, it made them feel deeper, more patient, more withholding. Under the modern beam of structured light and the cold steadiness of neural modeling, the old basalt faces did not confess. They only shifted, just enough, until the current model looked incomplete. And once that happens, the mind cannot quite return to sleep in the old way. It has to wander a little farther. It has to ask whether the heads were meant only to be seen, or whether they were built to hold. Hold power, hold memory, hold alignment, hold a sequence of transformations from one generation to the next. The buried data cannot be unseen now. The lines are there. The recess is there. The void is there. The spiral turns softly in the dark stone, whether we can explain it yet or not. In the next part of this journey, we will move farther outward from the heads themselves and into the ceremonial landscape around them. The plazas, the buried platforms, the earthworks, the quiet geometry of place. Because if these faces are speaking more clearly under the scan, then perhaps the land around them has been speaking just as long, only in a language we are finally learning to hear. The next thing researchers did was step back from the faces and look at the ground around them, because a monument is never only itself. A monument belongs to paths, platforms, sight lines, buried edges, the slope of a plaza, the angle of the sun at morning, the way water gathers after rain. If you were standing at San Lorenzo at first light, before heat had fully lifted from the earth, you would not just see sculpture. You would see an arrangement, mounds rising where the land had been shaped by human labor, broad artificial surfaces laid across the old bedrock, long lines in the terrain that at first seem natural, until you keep looking and notice how straight they are. This is one of the quiet truths that modern scanning has sharpened. The Olmec heads do not sit in meaningless space. They belong to ceremonial centers that were planned. San Lorenzo had an enormous plateau, reshaped by human hands. La Venta had formal arrangements of mounds, platforms, and buried offerings. Tres Zapotes held its own pattern of monuments and settlement. The heads, once treated in popular imagination as isolated marvels, are now harder to separate from the wider architecture of the sites that held them. AI models did not discover that these places were complex. Archaeologists already knew that. What the newer mapping has done is deepen the exactness of that complexity. Researchers fed drone imagery, old excavation maps, soil data, and LiDAR-based terrain models into systems trained to compare slope, proportion, and orientation across large spaces. The result was not a single revelation, but a sharpening. Slight alignments became clearer. Distances once treated as approximate began to look controlled. Raised areas corresponded more tightly to monument placement than expected. In some sectors, the model suggested that paths of movement through the sites were not casual, but choreographed. A person approaching a head from one direction would see it slowly rise against a platform edge. Approaching from another direction, the face would stay hidden until the last moments. That kind of controlled visibility matters in ritual landscapes. It means the monument was not only made, it was staged. At La Venta, 4 colossal heads were found, buried inside a massive ceremonial platform. That fact has hovered over the field for years, but the newer modeling gave it fresh weight. Burial is not neutral. Objects are buried in different ways for different reasons. Some are hidden for protection. Some are retired. Some are transformed into offerings. The heads at La Venta do not feel like trash. They feel arranged, concluded, placed into the earth as if the ground itself had to close over them at the proper time. You know that feeling when a room has been cleaned, not in an ordinary way, but after something important has happened there. Chairs placed back in order, curtains drawn, ashes cooled, nothing broken, yet the air tells you the event is over. The buried heads give me that feeling. They seem less discarded than finished. AI-based reconstruction of the platform layers made the setting harder to dismiss as random fill. The positions of the heads in relation to retaining fills and construction stages suggested intention. The site itself had gone through multiple building episodes, one layer rising over another, surfaces remade, spaces transformed. This means the Olmec were not merely making monuments and leaving them under the open sky forever. They were reworking ceremonial space over generations. A head could belong to one phase of meaning, then another. Public display could become burial. Portrait could become offering. Political image could become sealed memory. Some heads also show signs of deliberate damage. This has often been read as political defacement, and that may be correct in some cases. A roula false. His image is struck. Ancient societies knew very well how to wound memory through art. But if the heads belong to ritual cycles as well as political ones, then damage might not always mean hatred. It might mean deactivation. Certain features could be altered not to insult the monument, but to change its status. A flattened section, a chipped contour. A worked surface could mean the object had crossed from one ceremonial condition into another. The scans have not solved that problem. They have only made it more vivid. Overlapping tool traces and reworked surfaces imply that several heads lived more than one life. One monument may preserve evidence that it was once another kind of object, perhaps a throne, perhaps a block with architectural or ceremonial use. In one case, researchers noted a form on the back that resembles the remains of a seat. Time and erosion have softened it, but the suggestion lingers. If true, then a head was not born as a head. It became one. That possibility changes the emotional shape of the story. A transformed carved face carries ghost geometry. It remembers what it used to be, even after it has learned another role. The hidden spirals, recesses, and internal anomalies found by scanning begin to sit differently in the mind once reuse becomes plausible. They may be remnants from a prior form, carefully preserved or partially incorporated into a later one. Yet even this calmer explanation does not remove the mystery, because reuse raises its own questions. Why preserve certain hidden patterns? Why allow a spiral to remain on a surface not meant for casual viewing? Why leave a socket-like depression beneath the base? Why carve with such precision into a monument that might later be buried? This is where some scholars have started speaking, very carefully, about memory systems, In many early societies, not all knowledge was written in lines of text. Sometimes it lived in arrangement, orientation, sequence, and proportion. A monument could store meaning by where it stood, how it faced, what stood near it, what lay beneath it, and what was buried with it. The heads may have functioned inside a landscape of spatial memory, not a library in the modern sense, but a ceremonial archive, a system where stone, earth, and alignment carried information through repetition and place. That sounds abstract until you look more closely at the sites. Platforms at San Lorenzo and La Venta show proportional relationships that are not easy to laugh away. Mounds align with one another. Some features appear to echo river paths. Others fit solar positions at particular times of year. Mesoamerican architecture later became famous for these alignments. But even here in the older Olmec world, the habit of tying sacred space to directional order may already have been active. If so, then the heads are not simply portrait sculptures dropped wherever a ruler wanted them. They are nodes in a larger design. At least 5 heads appear to face cardinal directions: north, south, east, or west. That alone is not proof of a cosmological program, but it gains force once paired with the site-wide evidence of planning. A face turned east may participate in a ritual grammar of rebirth, timekeeping, or territorial order. A face turned north may complete a pattern with a platform, an altar, a buried cache, a processional path. The more the site is modeled, the less random these placements seem. One of the more intriguing findings came from the back of a head at Tres Zapotes, where a faint sign, small and recessed, appeared under enhanced study. It looked like a cross within a circle. Small, easy to miss, not placed for casual admiration. That makes it feel practical, or perhaps ceremonial in a restricted way. Some have suggested it could have served as a directional marker for installation, helping align the monument relative to other structures. Others think it may belong to a symbolic language still poorly understood. Either way, it does not behave like casual decoration. Hidden marks usually work for those who know where to look. This possibility grows stronger when the heads are compared with other Olmec objects: altars, thrones, figurines, and carved monuments often combine public image with deeper symbolic structure. Human figures emerge from cave-like niches. Rulers appear with ropes, captives, or supernatural beings. Surfaces carry iconography that links politics and myth so tightly that the two become nearly impossible to separate. The heads may have been simpler in visible iconography, but simplicity on the outside does not require simplicity in function. In fact, the cleaner the outer image, the more it may rely on context to complete its meaning. AI modeling has also encouraged researchers to revisit the heads as part of movement rather than static display. Processional routes through ceremonial centers matter, where a visitor begins. When a face becomes visible, whether the monument is approached uphill or downhill, whether the sun sits behind it or strikes it from the side, in a reconstructed movement model, one head at San Lorenzo seems to emerge gradually, as if from the edge of an engineered rise, becoming more imposing with every step. Another may have been encountered after passing through a narrowing corridor of space. These are not accidental theatrical effects. Ancient builders understood suspense because they worked with space itself. And then there is the possibility that some heads were not primarily intended for constant view at all. We assume that a face carved so large must have been built to dominate public attention. But what if some were built for periodic activation, revealed at certain times, partly hidden at others, used in rites that involved covering, burial, repainting, recarving, or repositioning? The evidence of burial, wreaths, and hidden detail all sit more comfortably in that frame. The head becomes less like a statue in a square and more like a participant in a cycle. The AI did not invent this possibility. What it did was make the older portrait theory feel insufficient by itself. Portraits do not need hidden spirals on invisible surfaces. Public memorials do not need buried sockets beneath their bases. Decorative monuments do not demand sub-millimeter symmetry where ordinary viewers would never measure it. The heads may still represent rulers. In fact, they probably do. But rulers in ancient ceremonial systems are rarely only political. They are also cosmological actors, ritual bodies, ancestors in waiting. This is why the phrase "more than monuments" has started to feel earned. The scans did not prove some supernatural claim. They did something more useful. They made reduction harder. They forced the monuments back into complexity. Picture one of these heads in its living setting. The air is wet and warm. Insects move above reeds by the water. The plaza surface has been packed and remade many times. A rula, or perhaps the image of a ruler already gone, sits in stone at the edge of a choreographed open space. The head faces a cardinal line. Beneath and around it lie fills, earlier surfaces, offerings, broken fragments from older monuments, maybe even the ghost of a previous function inside the stone itself. Priests or attendants know things the public does not. They know which side not to touch. They know what lies buried nearby. In such a world, the head is not simply art. It is active. The more teams compare the heads to the earthworks around them, the more that activity becomes plausible. Some buried platforms mirror proportional systems seen elsewhere on the sites. Some monument placements fit alignments that continue even after burial, which is especially interesting. A buried thing no longer needs to be seen to remain meaningful. It only needs to remain in the right place. That is not how decorative sculpture behaves. It is how ritual architecture behaves, and yet the darkness remains. Because with every pattern clarified, another opens. If the heads were active objects, what exactly did they do? If they stored memory, what kind? If they aligned with celestial or territorial order, how was that knowledge taught and renewed? If some were reused from older forms, what monuments came before the faces? We can feel the edge of a system. We are not yet inside it. That is where Part 4 must take us, deeper into the scans themselves, into the internal voids, the impossible smoothness, the cautious academic response, and the uneasy possibility that the current archaeological model is not wrong so much as unfinished. The heads, patient as ever, are still holding back, and the data is only just beginning to persuade us how much they have been holding. That may be the most human part of the mystery, not that the Olmec left us confusion, but that they left us just enough order to keep us returning. A line in the earth, a face in stone, a buried platform holding its silence. The machine sees more than we did, and still the old world keeps one hand closed. By the time the first scan results were written up for other scholars to inspect, the mood had changed. Not into panic, not into fantasy, into caution. Real caution. The kind that settles over a research room when the data is annoying in exactly the right way. The scanners had been brought in to preserve geometry and surface condition. The AI had been trained to identify ordinary categories of damage and workmanship. Yet the heads kept returning small refusals. Repeated details that should have fit better than they did. Internal suggestions of controlled space inside a material expected to behave more bluntly. Surface zones that worked in ways still not comfortably explained. One of the most troubling findings was also one of the hardest to dramatize. In two heads, models simulating internal density from reflected laser data and surface geometry suggested elongated regions that did not resemble ordinary volcanic voids. Researchers know basalt can contain natural cavities. No one disputes that. But these were not rounded bubbles, not casual little pockets from cooling. One appeared closer to a narrow shaft. Another suggested layering or a break plane that sat too neatly within the form. In one case, the internal surface looked almost flat. Flatness matters. Nature can be elegant, but it is rarely so politely aligned to the concerns of monument makers. The obvious response was repetition. Scan again. Process again. Use another software environment. Change the model assumptions. The same features remained. That does not automatically make them artificial. It only means they belong to the stone itself, not to a glitch in the machine. Once that threshold is crossed, interpretation becomes the real battle. Some geologists argued that unusual cooling histories in volcanic rock can create shapes less regular than textbooks suggest. They are right to say so. Stone does not owe us simplicity. Others countered that these particular features sat too comfortably within zones of broader monument design to be waved away as coincidence. They were too isolated, too clean in relation to the surrounding mass. Again, no one sensible leaped toward miracles. But neither could the older language of simple portrait carving absorb the discomfort without strain. Then there were the tool mark problems. In at least one head, the AI highlighted surface patterns that looked more like grinding than pecking. That distinction sounds technical until you remember what basalt demands from a human hand. Pecking with stone tools can rough out form. Grinding can refine. The Olmec understood abrasives in other contexts, especially with smaller luxury materials like jade. But to produce certain broad, smooth zones and extremely controlled fine lines at the scale of the heads would require not just labor, but consistent labor, abundant abrasive material, and a planning system that has not yet been recovered archaeologically in direct form. This is one of the reasons the scans have unsettled people beyond the usual academic circle. They do not prove that the Olmec had lost machines hidden in the jungle. They do something more interesting. They expose a gap between what the surviving tool record has shown clearly and what the monuments themselves seem to require. Gaps are where speculation breeds, but they are also where real work begins. Symmetry became another battlefield. One head in particular, displayed facial alignment so precise that the deviation across major features was less than 2 millimeters from one side to the other. Across a monument of that scale, that is astonishing. Not impossible, but astonishing. A modern sculptor with measuring aids would respect it. A freehand carver working in hard volcanic stone without metal would have had to maintain an extraordinary discipline of layout from the earliest roughing out to the final refinements. Researchers began asking more seriously whether the Olmec used modular planning methods, templates made of perishable material, chord grids, calibrated reference points marked lightly and later polished away. We may never find those tools if they were made from wood, fiber, cloth, or soft compounds. The earth is selective in what it returns. It keeps the heavy things and lets the rest become rumor. But the heads themselves may preserve the consequences of such tools even after the tools are gone. The faint, recessed spiral on the back of one head remained especially troublesome in discussion. A groove less than 0.5 millimeter deep, yet running in an orderly curve outward from a center point over nearly 1 meter of length, is not easy to dismiss as accidental. The AI did not merely notice it once. Different lighting reconstructions continued to pull it forward. Because the surface was not one intended for obvious public display, the spiral resisted the usual decorative explanation. It was too hidden to impress a crowd and too deliberate to ignore. Some researchers proposed that it could be a guide from an earlier stage of carving, perhaps belonging to a prior monument form before the block became a head. Others suggested symbolic significance, perhaps linked to water, breath, wind, or cycles of time. None of those ideas has won. The spiral waits. A polished depression beneath the chin of another head raised similar trouble, invisible in ordinary viewing, subtle enough to escape decades of inspection. It emerged only under the patient raking logic of digital surface analysis. Not large, not dramatic, yet its very placement is what makes it so difficult. Why refine a hidden depression beneath a chin unless it once related to another mounting system, another use, another stage of carving, or another layer of meaning? The same question echoes through the circular recess near the buried base. Hidden details are rarely for the casual eye. When the first round of findings reached wider academic readers through a peer-reviewed journal, the tone remained admirably controlled. No impossible claims. No buried lasers. The authors described the scans, the methods, the anomalies, and the limits. Then they did the most respectable thing a researcher can do in a genuinely strange moment. They admitted that the current interpretive model does not yet account for everything that had been observed. That sentence matters more than a sensational headline ever could. The current model is incomplete. Such words are the honest engine of scholarship. After publication, requests for access to the digital models increased. More teams wanted to test the data. Funding applications were submitted for deeper scans and expanded comparative studies. Some hoped for portable tomography strong enough to map interior volumes more confidently. Others wanted more extensive geochemical comparison with basalt sources across the Tuxtlas Range. Still others wanted broad pattern comparison between finished heads, unfinished heads, known reused monuments, and smaller carved Olmec works. The ideal next step was not argument. It was more looking, As those conversations unfolded, another important control remained in the background: the unfinished head at La Cobata. That sculpture showed rough expected working traces without the same class of anomalies. This mattered because it suggested the AI was not simply over-interpreting every surface with a poetic heart. The system could distinguish between ordinary incomplete carving and the stranger layers present elsewhere. Another thread in the debate involved material sourcing. Most Olmec heads are linked to basalt from the Sierra de los Tuxtlas. Yet one scanned head showed enough mineral and magnetic difference to raise the possibility of a less expected source area. Not a fantastical source, simply a different quarry zone or transport pattern than the current model emphasizes. Even modest source variation could matter, because quarry selection is never only geological. It is logistical, political, ritual. A community does not move 50 tons of volcanic stone without reasons that touch labor systems, authority, memory, and probably sacred geography as well. The more I sit with that, the more the heads feel less like giant sculptures and more like convergences. Stone source, human muscle, planned space, hidden marks, reuse, orientation, burial, precision, political image, ritual object, all of it converging in one face. AI has a way of making that convergence harder to ignore, not because the machine is wise in any mystical sense, because it can hold more small observations together than a tired human mind can comfortably manage. It can compare micro-relief across broad surfaces without boredom. It can test symmetry, density, and line recurrence, while human researchers go get coffee and wonder if they are being unfair to the stone. The result is not a replacement for human interpretation. It is more like a pressure, a steady pressure forcing older categories to loosen. And once they loosen, the implications widen beyond the heads themselves. If these monuments contain hidden layers of design, then what about the platforms around them? What about the buried plazas? What about the earthworks and drainage lines that were mapped too early with too little resolution? What else in Olmec archaeology has been called simple because our older tools could not see its finer logic? It may turn out that the heads are only the first objects to feel the full beam of this new scrutiny. There is another possibility, too. One that is less dramatic, but perhaps more profound. The scans may be showing us not advanced technology in the popular sense, but advanced planning in the ancient sense. A tradition of monument making more mathematically disciplined, more layered, and more context-bound than the old story allowed. That would not diminish the mystery. It would deepen it, because then the real revelation is not that something impossible happened. It is that an early civilization understood stone, proportion, and ceremonial design at a level we had been too comfortable underestimating. That kind of underestimation has a long history. Ancient people without metal tools are imagined as simpler than they were. Cultures without vast surviving written archives are flattened into clever but limited builders. Then a monument survives, or a buried city appears under LiDAR, or a digital model reveals sub-millimeter order, and the old ladder of assumptions begins to wobble. The Olmec have been standing near the bottom of too many such ladders for too long. What the academic response has shown so far is not collapse of the field, but healthy resistance and growing curiosity. Some scholars remain cautious to the point of irritation, which is often a good sign. Others are more open to rethinking chronology of carving stages, workshop methods, and monument function. Nearly all agree on one thing. The heads deserve a new generation of study, using tools capable of seeing what previous generations could not. If you were in one of those labs late at night, with the data rotating slowly on a screen, you might feel the odd intimacy that comes when ancient art becomes measurable without becoming ordinary. A stone cheek becomes a set of curves. A hidden groove becomes a line of values. A void becomes a density problem. Yet somehow the monument does not flatten into numbers. It becomes stranger, more itself. The face remains calm, while the data around it grows increasingly restless. By now, the line that repeats in quiet conversations is simple. The data cannot be unseen. Once, a hidden shaft, a polished strip, a buried recess, a spiral, a near-perfect axis, and unexplained microscoring have all entered the record. The old certainty does not return intact. Even if each individual anomaly finds a calm explanation later, the cumulative effect has already done its work. The monuments are deeper now, and depth changes behavior. Researchers are looking again at the land around San Lorenzo and La Venta, at foundations beneath platforms, at monument fragments once treated as secondary, at old excavation notes that may hide overlooked clues. Digital models are being refined. Comparative databases are growing. The heads have become not endpoints of admiration, but beginnings of inquiry. That is the place we have reached tonight. Not a solved enigma, a threshold. The Olmec civilization vanished more than 2,000 years ago. Their language has thinned into fragments. Their daily life survives in pieces. Yet these vast stone faces, once thought to be silent examples of early power, are beginning to reveal a second layer under modern light and machine patience. In Part 5, the story will move outward again, from the heads to the buried plazas, platforms, and surrounding ground that may hold the rest of the system. Because once a monument begins to show hidden logic, the question is no longer only how it was made. The question becomes what larger design it once served, and how much of that design is still sleeping under the soil. By this point, the attention of the researchers had begun to move away from the faces alone and out into the wider ground, because once a monument starts behaving like one piece of a system, the silence around it begins to feel crowded. A head on its own is already a challenge. A head aligned with a platform is a stronger one. A head aligned with buried geometry, repeated distances, old river paths, and construction layers become something else entirely. It becomes the visible edge of a buried intention. The first stage of that wider search was practical. Archaeologists, surveyors, imaging specialists, and computer modelers gathered the old excavation plans from San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes, then fed them into new mapping systems together with drone photography, LIDAR, terrain data, soil resistance surveys, and topographic measurements recorded across many seasons. Recently, researchers ran those site maps through AI models trained to compare shape, spacing, and directional relationships across fragmented landscapes. And what emerged was not a neat answer. but a troubling kind of order. Features, once treated as isolated, began to group themselves. Mounds echoed other mounds. Buried edges sat on lines with heads. Distances repeated just often enough to make coincidence uncomfortable. At San Lorenzo, the great artificial plateau has always been one of the most astonishing facts of the Olmec world. It is not merely a hill. It is a reshaped surface, a place where enormous quantities of earth were moved, flattened, raised, and disciplined. Even before the newest digital work, archaeologists understood that this was no casual settlement. Still, older studies had limits. They saw sectors, trenches, monuments, and drainage features. But the newer AI-assisted modeling could hold all of those fragments at once. It began comparing line against line, slope against slope, monument against orientation. Small regularities grew louder. One reconstructed pattern suggested that several heads, platforms, and mounded features at San Lorenzo may have belonged to a planned ceremonial corridor, not a corridor with walls and a roof like a palace hallway, but a ceremonial movement path shaped by earth itself. The ground rose and narrowed in ways that controlled what a person could see while approaching. One head would appear only after a change in elevation. Another would remain partly hidden until the viewer came onto a flatter open surface. If that interpretation is correct, then these faces were staged in sequence, almost like stations of arrival. Honestly, that is one of the details that keeps catching at me. Ancient people understood suspense. They understood that revelation can be timed. A monument shown too early is one thing. A monument made to emerge after a turn in the path is another. The machine did not invent that human instinct. It only helped make the geometry visible again. At Leventa, the buried world is even more haunting. The site is famous for massive clay constructions, arranged mounds, offerings of greenstone, and carefully ordered ceremonial space. When AI-enhanced terrain models were compared with excavation records from the buried heads, a possibility grew stronger. The heads there may once have belonged to a larger spatial program tied to both direction and depth. Their final burial was not the destruction of meaning, but part of it. They may have continued to matter precisely because they remained in place beneath later construction. In ritual architecture, burial can preserve force. A hidden thing can still anchor a site. This idea gains weight when you look at how often Olmec builders seem to have worked with layers. Floors laid over earlier floors. Platforms built atop older surfaces. Offerings sealed beneath later architecture. Sculpture recarved from previous monuments. The Olmec do not seem to have thought in terms of pure replacement. They seem to have thought in terms of accumulation. One act settling over another. One meaning folded into the next. In that kind of world, a buried head is not gone. It is stored in the architecture. The AI systems, trained to search for repeated proportion and axis relationships, also began suggesting that some platform edges and monument placements may mirror celestial directions more tightly than expected. This must be handled carefully. Archaeology is littered with overeager star theories, and the sky is an easy place for the imagination to run away. Still, cardinal orientation does matter in Mesoamerican planning, and in several Olmec settings, the heads appear to take their place within directional logic rather than random display. Some faced north or east with a steadiness that now seems more deliberate when compared with the surrounding site geometry. At least one model compared monument lines against solar rise and set positions at key points in the year. The results were not perfect, but they were suggestive. Certain placements sat close enough to seasonal light pathways to invite further testing. Not proof, an invitation. That is often how real mysteries proceed. They do not hand over a confession. They leave a small, straight track through wet earth and ask whether you are patient enough to follow. Another line of inquiry led toward water. The Olmec lived in wet lowland landscapes where rivers, channels, and seasonal flooding shaped everything. Water was not background. It was power, movement, nourishment, danger, and likely sacred logic. Some of the newer spatial analyses suggested that monument placements at San Lorenzo may reflect remembered or controlled relationships with water flow, whether old channels, redirected drainage, or symbolic river paths built into ceremonial design. A head facing a plaza may also have faced a vanished line of water. A mound may answer both a solar angle and a drainage need. Sacred planning and practical engineering do not cancel each other. In early civilizations, they often hold hands. The possibility that the heads were part of a mnemonic system has also grown more difficult to dismiss. In societies with limited surviving written records, memory can be anchored in space. A person walks a path and remembers a sequence. A monument marks a lineage, a season, a rite, an origin story, a political claim. Position carries knowledge. Scale carries rank. Orientation carries relation. If the Olmec heads belong to such a system, then the hidden marks found on them, the spiral, the recessed sign, the strange internal features, may not be decorative mysteries at all. They may be small parts of a much wider grammar. There is a lovely strangeness in that possibility. A face in stone as a storage device, not in the modern electronic sense, of course, but in the older human sense. A thing shaped to hold a pattern of memory across generations. The head remembers who stood here. The head remembers where the sun rose on a certain morning. The head remembers a line of succession, a ritual turn, a flood, a founding, a burial. It holds by standing. The more digital comparisons were made, the more the spaces around the heads began to look curated rather than merely occupied. Some plazas seemed proportioned to frame the monuments. Some mounds mirrored each other at distances too regular to shrug off. Even buried offerings found decades ago began to take on new significance once inserted into broader site models. It was as though the old excavations had been a box of scattered notes, and the AI was helping place the notes on the same table. One especially suggestive comparison involved hidden or partly buried features beneath later platform fills. Soil-resistant scans and terrain modeling do not read like a fairy tale, yet they can produce the same hush when they suggest a shape where none should be. At La Venta, some researchers began speaking quietly about the possibility of additional formal foundations still sealed beneath known ceremonial areas. Not proven chambers, not lost halls, just foundations, edges, and arranged substructures that imply we have not yet found the full frame in which the heads once worked. You know that feeling when you lift a rug in an old room and find not emptiness underneath, but another pattern. That is what this stage of the investigation feels like. The heads were once the pattern we looked at. Now they may be the rug. The buried plazas matter because they remind us how much of Olmec civilization is still underfoot. Tropical soils cover and soften quickly. Rivers shift. Agriculture and later settlement erase outlines. Archaeology in such places is often like trying to read a sentence through cloth. LiDAR helped with that by revealing topography beneath vegetation. AI-assisted comparison is helping again by sorting subtle relationships that human observers might not notice across large, messy datasets. The result is not certainty, but a map of better questions. As these questions widened, a few researchers began revisiting older assumptions about labor and organization. If the heads formed part of a larger, coherent landscape system, then their creation required not only skilled sculptors, but planners, coordinators, and perhaps specialists in measurement, transport, and ceremonial design. That should not surprise us. Yet it gently shifts the old image of the Olmec from mysterious stone carvers into managers of monumental information. The head becomes one solved problem inside a bigger unsolved intelligence. That is why the phrase, "they were never just art," has started to sound less like a dramatic flourish and more like a plain description. Art, yes. Power, certainly. Memory, perhaps. Orientation device, maybe. Ritual anchor, very likely. Architectural component, increasingly plausible. All of those can exist together inside one object if the society that made it did not divide categories the way we do. The land itself supports that thought. Stand in imagination at dusk on one of those reshaped surfaces. The air is warm and heavy. The sky is dimming above wet, low country. Somewhere nearby, water moves with that slow, hidden sound that seems less like a river than a long breath in the dark. A colossal face sits ahead, calm, immense, and unreadable. Behind it rises a platform under which older surfaces sleep. Beneath that, perhaps another order. Around you, lines of earth and distance and direction are holding their places whether you understand them or not. In such a setting, the monument is not passive. It belongs to an active field of relation. That field is what researchers are trying to recover now. Not merely what each head looks like, but how each one behaves inside its landscape. What it faces. What faces it? What lies beneath? What stood near it when the site was alive? What paths led toward it? What sequences of appearance and concealment structured human experience around it? The AI can assist because it does not tire of comparison. It can test distances, axes, visibility lines, and proportional clusters across a whole site, while human scholars argue productively over meaning. And the meaning is still open. Some see chiefly ceremonial design. Others emphasize political theater. Rulers placed within sacred geometry to make power feel woven into the cosmos. Some prefer a memory system model, where landscape arrangement helped preserve social knowledge. Some think reuse remains the key, that the hidden anomalies belong mostly to earlier forms, recut into later heads. None of these positions yet defeats the others. What matters tonight is that the old reduction is failing. The heads do not stand alone. They belong to a buried conversation between monument and land. The AI did not write that conversation. It only illuminated enough of the page for us to realize there was writing there all along. And once you see that, the next question comes naturally. If the heads were part of a wider system, and if that system extends under platforms, plazas, and forgotten foundations, then what else lies sealed below? What else has been misread because we treated the visible stone as the whole story? That is the road ahead now. Deeper into hidden ground. Deeper into the uneasy marriage of archaeology and machine vision, where every answer seems to clear its throat and then become another question. And maybe that is why the newest maps feel less like a technical report and more like the beginning of a return. Not a return to certainty, but to proportion. The Olmec were not leaving behind large faces in empty fields. They were shaping ceremonial worlds where stone, soil, water, and distance worked together. The head was one note in a larger chord. Once you hear the chord, even faintly, it becomes hard to go back to hearing only the note. The land itself starts sounding annotated, as if every rise and buried edge has been waiting for someone to place the monuments back into sentence form. By now, the story had reached that uneasy point where data begins to behave like a witness. Not a complete witness, not one who tells everything in one calm sitting. More like a witness who keeps remembering one difficult detail after another, each too small to transform the case alone, but together enough to make the room go very still. The Olmec heads had always been respected. Now they had become evidence against our own confidence. The phrase that kept surfacing in interviews and conference notes was remarkably modest. The current model is incomplete. I like that sentence because it carries no costume, no theatrical lightning, no grand declaration that history has collapsed. Just an honest admission that something in the established picture leaves too many edges exposed. For serious researchers, that kind of sentence is not weakness. It is the sound of a door unlocking. Recently, teams working with high-resolution scans, surface meshes, and AI-based anomaly detection compared several heads side by side, along with unfinished and recarved examples. And the pattern that emerged was deeply irritating in the best possible way. The anomalies did not distribute themselves randomly. Hidden recesses appeared where decoration made little sense. Precision increased in zones unlikely to matter to a casual observer. Internal irregularities repeated only in certain finished monuments. Surface bands carried material differences not yet matched in control samples from known quarry sources. The machine was not finding one mystery. It was finding a family resemblance among mysteries. That family resemblance matters. A single strange detail can be an accident. Two can be dismissed as noise. But when multiple heads across separate sites show layered design, hidden geometry, or unexplained working traces, the burden shifts. The burden no longer rests on the anomaly to justify its existence. It begins resting on the older interpretation to explain why so many irregular features gather under the same class of monument. One team looked again at the polished strip across a forehead, where traces of hematite and magnetite had been detected within the upper layer of basalt, rather than sitting on it like ordinary pigment. The raised band did not align neatly with visible headdress decoration. It crossed expected visual logic. Under AI enhancement, it also showed fewer microfractures than surrounding stone, as though the surface there had been worked or altered differently. researchers remained careful. Perhaps it reflects unusual quarry composition. Perhaps a now lost treatment process. Perhaps some combination of polishing and mineral transfer during carving. Yet the very effort to explain it reveals the pressure the data is applying. Ordinary portrait carving should not keep requiring extraordinary footnotes. Then, there was the matter of the repeated line pattern under the jaw of one head. Extremely fine, parallel, shielded from obvious weathering, and visible only in three-dimensional analysis. The striations did not match known Mesoamerican stone tool signatures comfortably. The comparison to modern machining was made cautiously and then immediately hedged, as it should be. But the comparison happened for a reason. The lines were too consistent, too controlled, too shallow in their irregularity. Not proof of impossible technology, evidence of an unfinished explanation. This is where the human side of the research becomes strangely moving. I imagine the archaeologists staring at those enlarged surfaces the way a person stares at a familiar face after being told there is a hidden scar beneath the makeup. You do not stop recognizing the face, but you cannot return to the earlier innocence of looking. Every contour now carries a second story. The same thing has happened to the public meaning of the heads. For decades, they have stood in books and documentaries as icons of ancient achievement, impressive and enigmatic, but fundamentally stable in interpretation. Roulé portrait, markers of power, emblems of a foundational civilization. All of that may still be true. Yet now the stone itself is pressing back. It is saying, in its slow mineral way, that there were stages here, methods here, hidden features here, relationships here that the old summary did not keep. One reason this matters so much is that the Olmec are often framed as precursors, as if their primary role in history were to stand before the Maya and later Mesoamerican traditions, like a deep inhalation before the fuller song. But the heads resist being treated as merely early. They are too finished in some ways and too unresolved in others. The scans intensify that resistance. They suggest a technical and conceptual density that deserves its own central place, not only a supporting role in someone else's future. Another team, after reviewing the peer-reviewed publication and access files, requested permission to test more aggressive internal imaging protocols on selected heads. Funding was sought for deeper scanning, more complete mineral mapping, and finer analysis of buried monument bases. Applications were also drafted to revisit surrounding platform architecture and compare hidden signatures in the heads to unseen signatures in the earthworks around them. In other words, the field had begun to pivot. The next question was no longer simply, how were the heads carved? It was, what larger system do these hidden features belong to? That shift feels important enough to linger on. When a field moves from object study to system study, the past becomes harder and more beautiful at the same time. A face is one mystery. A network is another. A single head can be admired. A set of heads linked by orientation, internal design, buried geometry, and ceremonial staging begins to feel like an argument left waiting for us to hear it. Some researchers now speak of the heads as data structures. That phrase can sound cold, but I think it is more poetic than it first appears. Data structure does not have to mean computer. It can mean any object deliberately arranged to hold relationships. A knot can be a data structure. A template plan can be one. A line of standing stones can be one. If the heads store rulership, direction, sequence, memory, and ritual status through their placement and form, then calling them data structures is not an insult to their artistry. It is a recognition of their discipline. The AI helped with that recognition by doing what humans struggle to do over long periods without bias or fatigue. It measured tiny differences repeatedly. It compared expected erosion against actual microtopography. It highlighted symmetry values. It reconstructed hidden portions. It cross-checked anomaly classes against controls. Human experts still had to interpret every result, argue over every possible natural explanation, and restrain the hunger for spectacle. But the machine widened the field of the visible. And once widened, the visible became inconvenient. The unfinished head at La Cobata looked ordinary in the expected ways. Rough tool traces, incomplete shaping, no secret precision asserting itself where it did not belong. That control case is one of the quiet heroes of this whole story. It reminds us that the AI was not inventing complexity everywhere. Some stone remained exactly as expected, which means the stranger heads became harder to dismiss as the product of an overeager algorithm. The next stage will likely be slower than the public would prefer. That, too, is part of the mood. People want the hidden chamber, the impossible device, the single sentence that can be printed on a thumbnail and carried around like a talisman. Real work moves differently. It requests permits. It argues over scan calibration. It waits for dry seasons. It fights for budget lines. It peers at the same depression for a year and a half. There is something almost tender in that slowness. Ancient stone is met by patient human doubt. Between them, truth moves at a walking pace. Still, even at that pace, the implications are widening. If the Olmec heads preserve evidence of planning and hidden design beyond current expectations, then other monumental traditions in the region may need similar re-examination. Thrones, altars, carved blocks, buried offerings, even entire platform complexes might reveal second layers under improved scanning and AI comparison. One discovery breeds method. Method breeds a new archaeology. I have always found it strange that we often trust the survival of a monument more than the intention of the people who made it. We look at what remains visible and assume that visibility was the whole point. But ancient builders were perfectly capable of caring about what would never be casually seen. Hidden offerings prove that. Buried axes prove that. Foundation deposits prove that. Sacred alignments prove that. So why should a colossal head be exempt from hidden logic simply because its face is large and memorable? In a way, the AI scan has not made the Olmec heads supernatural. It has made them more human. Human in the sense that they now look more like things made by minds who planned in layers, reused important material, encoded meaning in placement, and accepted that some knowledge belongs below the surface. That is a very human habit. We do it in houses, in graves, in ceremonies, in the way we keep letters in drawers and names in families. The difference is that the Olmec did it in basalt the size of a room. So where does that leave us tonight? Not with an answer, with a pressure line running through the story. On one side stands the familiar model. Early rulers, monumental portraits, extraordinary labor, ingenious carving in a pre-metal world. On the other side stands the growing body of scan-based evidence. Hidden recesses, controlled internal irregularities, fine striation patterns, buried spirals, material anomalies, precision that feels more architectural than casual, spatial placement linked to wider ceremonial planning. Neither side cancels the other, but the second is beginning to stretch the first beyond comfort. And perhaps that is the real discovery. Not a forbidden object inside the stone, not a lost machine, not a neat little forbidden truth that can be wrapped and sold. The real discovery may be that the Olmec heads belong to a more layered intelligence than our inherited summary allowed. An intelligence of form, sequence, burial, and relation. An intelligence that did not vanish. Exactly, but fell out of readability until new tools gave us a different angle of light. Picture the scene one last time for tonight. A research room glowing softly from screens. Rotating meshes of ancient faces. Surface shadows deepened by software until hidden lines lift like whispers from the stone. Outside, the modern world hums on in traffic and weather reports and the light from phones. Far away in Mexico, the actual heads sit in their heat and silence, unchanged by all this attention. They have not become stranger. We have simply become less blind. That is a sobering comfort. The past did not move. We did. The machine did not create a mystery. It removed just enough fog for us to see the outlines of one that had always been there. From here, the story will keep widening. More scans, more cautious papers, more buried plazas reopened in the imagination before they are opened in the earth. More arguments over whether a groove is symbolic or structural, whether a void is natural or prepared, whether a face is only a face. And beneath all of it, the same steady fact. Something in these monuments does not sit neatly inside the timeline of assumptions we built around them. The anomalies are real. The caution is real. The incomplete model is real. And now that the data has entered the room, no one studying these heads seriously can pretend the old silence means what it used to mean. The stone is still silent, yes, but it is no longer mute. It has begun to answer in pattern, in density, in line, in buried order. The rest depends on whether we are willing to keep listening, and whether the ground around those ancient faces is ready to surrender the next layer of its long memory. There is a final gentleness in that thought. We are not conquering the mystery. We are being corrected by it. Every careful scan, every revised map, every reluctant footnote is a small act of humility before a civilization that still knows how to keep some of its intelligence folded inward. The heads remain calm through all of this. Calm as rain, dark stone. Calm as something made to outlast explanation. And perhaps that is why they are so hard to forget. They do not ask for belief. They ask for patience. Around them, the larger landscape waits as well. Platform under platform. Fill under floor. Old alignments, sleeping under roots, and weather and modern assumptions. The next discovery may be tiny. A shallow line. A hidden socket. A buried edge of packed clay. or it may be broad enough to redraw the ceremonial map. Either way, the direction is set now. The heads have forced the question open, and the ground has started answering. The deeper the teams looked, the harder it became to keep the old categories standing in their neat little rows. Portrait, monument, ritual object, reused stone, ceremonial marker. All of those labels still had value, but none of them felt large enough now. The heads had begun to behave like survivors from a system that had been broken apart, buried, and then mistaken for a gallery of separate objects. Once that idea takes hold, even gently, it changes the temperature of everything around them. Researchers started doing something wonderfully simple. They stopped asking only what each head was, and began asking what each head remembered. Not remembered in a magical sense, not in the feverish language people often rush toward when the past grows difficult, but remembered in the way architecture remembers. A wall remembers weight. A road remembers direction. A platform remembers ceremony. A monument can remember sequence. It can remember who approached it, from where, in what order, at what season, under what sky. That shift led to a series of experiments with simulation. Recently, specialists fed terrain models, scanned data, excavation maps, solar position records, and seasonal hydrology reconstructions into AI systems designed to test movement, visibility, and site logic over time. And what came back was unsettling in a very disciplined way. The heads did not act like isolated sculptures dropped into open space. In model after model, they began to make more sense when treated as points in choreographed landscapes. Sightlines formed. Processional approaches became plausible. Buried placements regained purpose. Even the heads that looked awkward in their present positions began to feel more coherent when older construction phases were restored digitally. At San Lorenzo, one simulation tested how a person moving through the reshaped plateau would encounter monuments during different times of day. The result was not dramatic in a theatrical sense, but it was powerful. A face that looked merely present at noon became imposing in low-angled morning light. Another, partly screened by elevation, would reveal itself only after a slow approach. This matters because ritual experience is often built from timing, not only from scale. To be seen suddenly is different from being watched gradually into existence. Ancient builders understood that. They understood shadows better than most of us do, because they lived with them rather than switching them off. You can almost feel it if you let yourself slow down enough. A warm lowland morning. Moisture still hanging in the air. The smell of earth and green water. Sandaled feet on packed clay. The broad flank of an artificial platform holding the first light while lower ground remains dim. Then, ahead, a massive stone face emerging by degrees, not because it moved, but because the path and the hill and the morning were arranged so that revelation happened in measured increments. That is not mere display. That is design working on a human nervous system. At La Venta, the simulations took on a different mood. There, the concern was less with dramatic arrival and more with buried continuity. When researchers digitally restored earlier construction layers around the heads that had been sealed within ceremonial platforms, the burial pattern began to look less like disposal and more like installation and depth. The heads may have continued participating in the life of the site after they were no longer visible. That idea sounds strange until you remember how often ancient ritual landscapes rely on hidden deposits. Foundations matter even when no one sees them. The hidden can still organize the visible. A thing can be active by being placed, not only by being looked at. Some scholars now suspect that at least certain heads may have functioned as anchors inside cycles of rebuilding. A monument could be displayed in one generation, partially altered in another, and then buried beneath a later sacred surface without losing authority. If so, the life of a head was not a straight line, from carving to admiration to abandonment. It was more like a series of reincarnations within the same ceremonial body. That would explain why reuse does not feel careless in the Olmec world. Recarving may not have been desecration. It may have been a transfer of force. The AI models also helped compare hidden features across heads with features found in other Olmec stoneworks. Throne-like monuments, altar forms, and recut blocks were examined for matching curvature, tool signatures, and dimensional rhythms. The results remain preliminary, but some overlaps suggest that the heads were born inside a broader sculptural economy where stone was selected, shaped, transformed, and possibly reassigned according to changing ritual or political needs. One colossal head may contain the memory of an earlier throne. One altar may preserve the proportions of an even older form beneath it. The stone, in other words, may have biographies. I have always loved that possibility, not because it is spooky, though it does carry a soft midnight feeling, but because it makes the Olmec artists and planners feel more vivid, more strategically alive. Imagine the conversations. This block once held one power. Now it must hold another. This face belongs to a ruler, yes, but also to a place in the turning of the site. This buried marker still matters, though no common eye will see it. That is not primitive thinking. That is complex cultural memory wearing the clothes of stone. Then came the geometry studies. These were approached carefully, because geometric claims can become absurd when every straight line is treated like revelation. Still, the AI was useful precisely because it could test whether apparent patterns held up under stricter measurement. Some did not. A few attractive theories simply faded under repeated comparison. That was healthy. The machine was not there to flatter desire. It was there to embarrass bad guesses as well as strengthen good ones. Yet some patterns did endure. Certain head placements matched proportional intervals within broader site layouts more consistently than chance would predict. Some directional alignments stayed stable across reconstruction scenarios. A few monument-to-platform relationships suggested intentional modular planning, as though builders were working within systems of repeatable distance rather than pure intuition. This does not mean the Olmec used blueprints in the modern sense. It means they may have measured and repeated with more rigor than older interpretations allowed. One head in particular, already noted for near-perfect facial symmetry, became even more interesting when researchers compared its proportions to platform edges and nearby monument spacing. There were echoes, not exact copies, not cartoonishly obvious ratios, but enough resonance to suggest that the sculptural face and the built environment may have been governed by related visual rules. A culture that can discipline a giant human face to that degree can likely discipline space as well. And then there is the possibility of instruction. Not written manuals, not numbered diagrams, but embodied instruction passed through workshops and ceremonial labor groups. If the heads were produced through modular planning, if certain hidden marks served as guides, if buried recesses and subtle surface cues belonged to staging or alignment practices, then at least some specialized knowledge must have been transmitted across generations. Someone knew where to start. Someone knew how to prepare. Someone knew when a block was not just a block, but a future face, a future marker, a future buried presence. That thought makes the silence around the heads feel crowded with absent hands. Apprentices shaping abrasive stones. Senior carvers running palms over damp-marked surfaces. Labor crews timing movement with ropes, logs, sledges, river stages, or methods we still do not fully understand. Ritual authorities deciding orientation. Builders checking platform relation. People arguing, perhaps softly, perhaps with great authority, over whether a monument should remain visible or be sealed into the next layer. The AI cannot recover those voices, but sometimes its maps and flags seem to outline where the voices once stood. The environmental side of the work has also grown more important. Hydrological reconstruction suggests that some monument placements may have related to changing water access or controlled movement through wet landscapes. The Olmec did not build an abstract space. They built in riverine environments where mud, flood, and season shaped possibility. A platform that seems ceremonial to us may also have been practical in ways that intensified its sacred role. A head positioned near an approach line may have watched over movement during dry months and reflected power differently during floods. Sacred architecture in such settings often negotiates instability rather than denying it. This may help explain why some features feel less permanent than we expect. Reuse, alteration, burial, and renewed construction may have been responses not only to politics or ritual cycles, but to the living behavior of the land. Rivers wander. Ground softens. Visibility changes. A monument in a low place can become a monument in a dangerous place. The answer is not always removal. Sometimes the answer is incorporation. Cover it. Raise the ground. Build over it. Keep it in the system while changing its role. The machine-based studies cannot prove every part of that story. Of course, they are tools, not oracles. The best teams working on the heads have been admirably restrained. They describe patterns. They propose possibilities. They publish limits. They repeat scans. They compare with controls. They invite challenge. That caution is not the enemy of wonder. It is the form wonder takes when it grows up. What is now becoming difficult to deny is the broad direction of the evidence. The heads are technologically richer than once assumed. Their surfaces contain hidden information. Their interiors may contain intentional or at least non-trivial complexity. Their placements likely relate to broader spatial logic. Their life histories include transformation. Their relation to the land appears disciplined, not casual. The old image of giant portraits in ceremonial centers has not been destroyed, but it has become too thin. And once a model becomes too thin, a civilization starts changing shape in the mind. The Olmec are no longer merely the makers of enormous faces. They begin to look like managers of ceremonial landscapes, of sculptural memory, of hidden design, of engineering choices we are only now learning to ask about properly. That does not make them alien. It makes them harder to patronize, which is perhaps why this story matters beyond the monuments themselves. For a long time, the heads have invited awe mainly because of their size. Now they invite respect for something quieter. Planning, restraint, layered intention. A society capable of making a face that dominates a plaza is impressive. A society capable of making that face work within visible and invisible systems of space. Burial, alignment, and transformation is something else. It asks us to upgrade our imagination. The coming years will likely bring more refined scans, more contested papers, more denied permits, more reopened trenches, and, if patience holds, a clearer map of how the heads belong to their worlds. Some anomalies may dissolve under better evidence. Others may sharpen. New examples may appear under restored platforms or erosion cuts. Old museum pieces may be rescanned and quietly begin causing trouble of their own. That is how archaeology moves when a method starts working. One answered doubt creates 3 more disciplined doubts behind it. And all the while, the heads will remain physically what they have always been. Basalt. Wait. Carved line. Broad cheek. Closed mouth. Helmeted brow. They will not glow. They will not perform. They will simply continue existing with a depth we failed to notice. There is something almost merciful in that. The past does not beg for our admiration. It waits for the quality of our attention. So tonight, the strongest thing we can say is also the most honest. The heads are part of a larger system, or at the very least, they keep behaving as though they are. Every new layer of measurement makes isolation less believable. The monuments answer each other. The platforms answer them. The buried foundations answer both. The land itself joins the conversation. And as that conversation becomes more audible, the final stretch of the mystery opens before us. Not just what the scans found, but what all of this means for the vanished people who made these stones speak in ways they never intended to make easy. Once the evidence reaches that point, where object, landscape, method, and doubt have all started leaning toward the same conclusion, a strange calm enters the story. Not the calm of resolution, more the calm that comes after realizing you have been standing in the foyer of a much larger house than you imagined. The heads remain in front of us, heavy and patient, but now the space behind them has deepened. Their silence is no longer empty. It is structured. What the AI changed, more than anything, was the scale of the question. In the beginning, the scans were meant to preserve, to document, to protect fragile surfaces from time, weather, and human damage. That alone would have been worthwhile. Instead, the digital record became a lantern. It shone into tool marks too fine for ordinary sight, into hidden recesses, into internal irregularities, into buried geometry, into relationships between monuments and earthworks that older methods could not easily hold together. It did not prove an impossible civilization. It did something more important. It proved that our comfortable explanation was undersized. When a model is undersized, the past starts leaking through its edges. That is what has happened here. A groove appears where no groove should matter. A density channel refuses to behave like a casual void. A spiral hides on a surface no audience was meant to admire. Facial symmetry drifts toward architectural precision. Buried placement starts looking intentional. Reuse stops reading like expedience and starts reading like continuity. None of these findings alone is loud. Together, they are difficult to ignore. There is an old habit in historical storytelling, especially with ancient societies, of praising ingenuity right up to the point where ingenuity becomes too disciplined for our assumptions. Then we soften it. We say instinct. We say mysterious. We say ceremonial and hope the word will do all the lifting. But ceremony is not the absence of intelligence. It is often intelligence operating through form. If the Olmec heads were ceremonial, that does not make them simpler. It may make them more exacting. Ritual objects often demand stricter placement, stricter material choices, stricter timing, stricter memory than ordinary public art. That may be why the newest interpretation has such force. The heads now seem less like isolated marvels and more like active components in a designed environment. They may have watched approaches, anchored, rebuilt sacred surfaces, preserved ruler memory, encoded direction, or helped structure ceremonies that moved through time as much as through space. They may have served political power by embodying it, but also by fixing it into a larger order of earth and sky. The old phrase, more than monuments, is beginning to sound almost embarrassingly modest. Some researchers have even begun to wonder whether the heads should be studied alongside early information systems. That idea still makes some scholars wince. And fair enough. The phrase can attract a great deal of nonsense. Yet if knowledge in early societies could be stored through arrangement, proportion, repetition, and hidden relation, then a monumental field can indeed behave like an archive. Not an archive of sentences in our sense, but of structured recall. Stand here. See this. Move there. Align with that. Remember the order. Remember the ruler. Remember the season. Remember the buried thing below your feet. Memory can be choreographed. Stone is good at keeping choreography. You know that feeling when a city starts making sense only after you learn the river that shaped it. Streets that seemed arbitrary suddenly become obedient to an older current. I think that is where we are with the heads. We have spent a long time staring at the streets. Now we are beginning to notice the river. The river, in this case, is not only water, though water matters. It is also method. The method of AI-assisted looking. That phrase deserves a little respect. There is so much noise around artificial intelligence now that it can be easy to miss the humble beauty of what it actually did here. It measured patiently. It compared without boredom. It flagged subtle departures from expectation. It reconstructed buried surfaces. It made old field notes speak to new scans. It served as a second pair of eyes, except not really eyes, more like a tireless habit of disciplined noticing. Still, the machine did not have the final word. Human expertise remains the center of the story. Archaeologists identified contexts. Material scientists checked compositions. imaging specialists tested scan reliability. Experts in erosion and stone weathering offered sober alternatives. Field historians re-examined old excavation records. The most convincing part of this entire process is precisely that no serious team rushed to declare the impossible. They stayed with the data. They let the mystery remain proportionate to the evidence. That restraint is why the mystery now feels stronger, not weaker. Wild claims burn hot and vanish. Careful questions keep walking. And this question is still walking. What exactly were these heads for? What happened to the earlier forms recut into some of them? Why bury active monuments inside later sacred architecture? Why do certain hidden features appear where public viewing cannot explain them? How far does the larger site logic extend? What still lies beneath unexcavated platforms and ceremonial ground? The land around the heads has become part of the answer. Or perhaps part of the better question. The next phase of research is likely to turn outward and downward at once. Outward toward broader mapping of plazas, mounds, pathways, and drainage systems. Downward toward sealed layers, buried foundations, and the forgotten lower lives of monuments. What else is under there? A recarved throne, a platform edge, a chamber, a patterned fill, a line of prepared stone. We do not know yet, but it is telling that the question no longer feels fanciful. It feels methodical. Imagine a future season of excavation. The air close and green. The ground opening by careful degrees under brushes, trowels, scanners, and tarped shade. A platform cut, revealing older packed surfaces. A hidden edge emerging. Then another. Somewhere nearby, a colossal head remains where it has always been. Broad face turned toward a direction chosen long ago. Above ground and below ground begin speaking to each other. That is the sort of moment this research is moving toward. Not the destruction of mystery, but its refinement. Honestly, that may be the gentlest possible outcome. To refine a mystery is better than to sensationalize it. The Olmec do not need our theatrics. They have already given enough. They carved mountain stone into human command. They moved unimaginable weight without metal, wheel, or draft animals in the way later worlds would define those tools. They shaped ceremonial landscapes with patience and force. And now, with the strange help of modern machines, they are teaching us that they also worked in layers we were too quick to flatten. The phrase, "what should not exist," has hovered over this story for a reason. Not because we have found proof of forbidden technology or some tidy lost age hiding under every platform, but because the heads contain details that should not exist inside the narrow version of Olmec capacity that many people had quietly accepted. The impossible thing may not be a machine mark. It may be our old underestimation. That is a harder lesson to package, but a deeper one to keep. Civilizations become mysterious, not only because they hide things from us, but because we often arrive already convinced of what they could not have done. Then a scan, a trench, a date, a residue, a hidden line in stone, and suddenly the arrogance shows through. The past was never small. Our models were. If the heads really are components in a larger sacred, political, spatial, and mnemonic system, then they deserve to be read as part of a living architecture of memory. They were not made merely to be admired. They were made to hold force, relation, sequence, authority, place, to hold through weather and rebuilding, to hold even when buried, to hold until another civilization walked past them without understanding, and another after that, and another still, until at last someone came with enough patience, enough mathematics, enough humility, and just enough machine light to see that the old stone was still mid-sentence. And what a sentence it is. Basalt from distant mountains. Faces individualized, yet disciplined. Hidden marks under the jaw. Buried sockets. Irregular density channels. Internal arcs. Spiral traces on the back. Material anomalies across a forehead band. Side alignments. Processional approaches. Reused monuments. Buried ceremonial continuity. Every piece by itself modest. Every piece together stubborn. The system is beginning to show itself, not all at once, but the way stars appear when the eye finally adjusts to darkness. That feels like the right image to end with. Not revelation as lightning, but revelation as adjustment. The heads have not suddenly spoken. We have simply lowered enough noise to hear the low register they were always using. The tone is still difficult. Much remains unresolved. Some anomalies may yet find ordinary explanations. Others may become stranger under better tests. New excavations may confirm the broader model, or complicate it in ways no one expects. That is all right. History is allowed to widen without rushing to close. Before sleep takes you fully, it is worth lingering on one final human detail. Every discovery in this story passed through hands. Someone unpacked a scanner and checked the charge twice. Someone wiped moisture from a lens in the field. Someone knelt beside ancient stone and watched a grid of light slide over a cheek carved more than 2,000 years ago. Someone back in a lab rotated a digital mesh by fractions and kept finding one more line that did not belong. Someone else, perhaps tired, perhaps skeptical, ran the comparison again, because real caution is repetitive. That chain of attention matters. The future of this mystery is not built only from machines. It is built from people willing to keep looking without forcing the stone to flatter their theories. There is comfort in that as well. We are not separated from the makers of the heads by intelligence, only by time, damage, and the long untidiness of burial. They arranged matter to preserve meaning. We use new tools to recover some of that arrangement. Their work was patient. Ours must be patient too, and maybe that is the quiet bridge between the two worlds. Not certainty, discipline. If more of the buried system rises in the years ahead, if another head is found unfinished below a platform, or a recut throne appears with hidden guide marks, or the ceremonial geometry sharpens under deeper surveys, the emotional truth will remain the same. The Olmec were thinking in larger structures than we gave them credit for. They were shaping not only objects, but experiences, not only faces, but fields of relation. The heads are the part that survived in obvious form. The rest has been waiting, in earth and shadow, for methods subtle enough to meet it. That waiting feels almost noble. Stone can afford patience. It outlasts every impatient explanation laid over it. Then one day, very late, a new question arrives, and the old monument quietly becomes new again. So let the mystery stay large for a moment. Let the stone remain heavy. Let the old ceremonial ground keep some of its night around it. Somewhere in southern Mexico, beneath roots and heat and weathered time, there are still shapes arranged by people who understood weight, memory, and distance in ways we are only beginning to respect again. The heads stand above that buried intelligence like calm witnesses, not bragging, not pleading, just enduring. And here, by softer firelight, far from the Gulf Coast and its wet earth, you can let that endurance become restful. The faces do not need solving all at once. The unanswered parts can stay where they are tonight, tucked into stone, into buried clay, into the patient gap between old craftsmanship and new perception. The machine has done its part. The scholars are doing theirs. The ground will answer in its own season. Until then, the heads keep watch in cardinal silence. The platforms sleep over what they still conceal, and the deeper system waits with all the calm in the world for the next careful hand to brush away a little more dust. Good night.